everybody. Is it warm out there? It's pretty nice up here. Let's have everyone come up. No, I'm just kidding. It's good to see all of you guys. We are continuing in a series that we started last week called Personal Poisons. And if you weren't here, the way I defined those personal poisons is as behaviors or feelings that have a personal toxic effect. And we went all through what that was. If you want to hear that message, you can go on YouTube and our YouTube channel and listen to that. But I want to go into today, we're going to look at 4 personal poisons over the next 4 weeks. And this week I want to look at what I think is maybe one of the most pronounced and toxic poisons that we drink as human beings. And that's the poison of undeserved shame. Now, undeserved shame, in one way or another, affects every single one of us. We don't always identify that we're feeling a sense of internalized shame, but it's really out there everywhere. Everywhere you look, if you begin to know what to look for, you can see how either that comes out of us or it comes out of people we know. You know, people may act a certain way, but if you're willing to really look and think through it, you say, you know what, they're not just angry. That's coming out of a sense of shame. That person's not just being critical and negative. That's a sense of shame that that person feels about themselves that they're expressing towards other people. And you see shame being put in people's lives all the time. Just last week, walking my kids to school, and as we're walking to school, we get on the campus and we're walking along, and I hear this mother yelling. Now that's not uncommon on a school morning, but this particular mother, and I've never seen her before, but what she did happens all the time in our homes. Her little child, and I'm going to say is about 4 years old, went running away from her, I guess, in the school parking lot. Now, any parent, their heart stops, their eyes get wide, and they yell, right? That's just typical. Stop! Don't go! Right? Because we're afraid. When we get afraid, we yell. We stop that type of thing. And so this little girl, and there was an older girl, maybe second grade with her. This little girl, she drags by the car and now is standing right on the walkway where all of us adults are and all of the kids are coming. So we're all viewing this. We all see this. And the little girl that ran off from her mother sees us. And the mother takes the child and grabs her by the arm and begins to kind of, give her a little, I want you to pay attention, a little shake. And she looks her in the eyes and she says, I've told you 1,000,000 times not to do that. What do you, blah, 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 blah. And she's going on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And the child is, just kind of looking at her mom, and her head is down like this, and she's looking over at us, and she's just, Now, what the mom thinks she's doing at that moment is getting the child's attention. Raise your hand if you know you got to get a kid's attention. She's getting the child's attention because, of course, she, one, is probably hurried and frantic like most moms on a school morning. But she also probably feels kind of afraid that her kid could run off and get hit by a car. Whenever we get out of our car in a parking lot, I always look at my younger kids and say, we're in a parking lot, you're short, people don't see you. So stay right by me. We're in a parking lot. They don't see you, and I don't want you hurt. Every time we get out of the car, I say, we're in a parking lot. You got to get their attention. So this child had run off, and the mom had grabbed it and shaken it in front of all of us adults and all the child's peers, a bunch of other kids. And the mom thought, of course, what she was doing was really making her point, right? I'm making my point. This kid is never going to run off on me. I do not want this child hurt. But what she was really doing, regardless if the child, maybe the child is strong-willed and will run off 1,000 times more, and what she did really had no impact that way. But what the mom was really doing, and what we really do as parents so often, and as people so often, the mom was just inflicting a sense of undeserved shame in this child. She was telling the child, in effect, you're stupid, and I don't want you to ever do that again. And you're so bad, I need to do what I'm doing in front of everybody so that they too can see that you are not a good child. Now, the mom would never say that probably in 1,000,000 years, but that's what the child receives. It's undeserved shame. Now, let's write down a definition real quick so we start to get a feel for what shame is all about. See if we can kind of pinpoint this a little bit. Shame can be defined as this. You ready? It is a heavy, painful feeling. Start with that. It's a heavy, painful feeling. So heavy that it will push your head down. You know what I'm saying? It will make your eyes drop. It's a heavy, painful feeling of being unacceptable, inferior, or defective. Unacceptable, meaning not just, people aren't accepting me for who I am and they need to accept me. Not that. Unacceptable means I believe I myself am not an acceptable person. I don't measure up. I'm inferior, meaning other people are better than I am. And one of the things people who wrestle with shame do is they continually compare themselves to other people and find that they don't measure up. You always hear people say, I'm just not as good as others. I don't measure up. I'm just not doing what I should, type of thing. That's all shame. And defective is an important word, because what defective really means is at the end of the day, I look at myself and I say, you're broken. That's just the bottom line. Other people are not, you are. There's just something inside of you that just is broken, defective. Other people, no. Me, yes. And so you begin to hear people who wrestle with shame say things like, God, I'm so stupid. Or even go so far as to say, you know what, God, I hate myself sometimes. I just hate myself. That's shame. That's shame coming out of a person. A deep sense, a heavy, painful feeling, sometimes a dull weight, sometimes a sharp pain, but a heavy, painful feeling that says to myself, that I say to myself, as a human being, I'm defective. That's pain. That's what that shame looks like. And you can see this in the scriptures. Look at this. Up on the screen, let's look at just one verse. This is a lot in the scriptures, but this is King David speaking. He says this, my disgrace is before me all day long, and my face is covered with shame. That's what shame feels like. There have been studies on this with infants, children 6 months and younger, where when mom, if they have a fairly healthy relationship, or dad, but particularly mom, since mom is the one who nurses and tends to be, there's that bond there that a mother has that a father doesn't typically have. That when mom is in the room with a child who is at a certain age, the child will look at the mom, the heart will race, the eyes will get big, and a smile will begin to form when mom is there and mom is interacting with the child. Now, mom leaves the room to go get something, and the child will wait, and as the child hears mom coming back into the room, the child will look in the direction. It always has to be a few months old to be able to do this, but will look in that direction and will begin to kind of straighten up, and the eyes will get big again. But now mom comes back in the room, but this time, she's preoccupied or whatever. There's a lot to do in the role of mom. She doesn't meet the child's eyes, and the child is looking, waiting for mom to come into the room. And if mom comes into the room, but she doesn't look at the child, at this 6-month-old, the child's neck muscles will actually go slack. So it's a biological sort of reaction, a physical reaction to an emotional feeling. The child's neck muscles will actually go slack, and the head will drop, and the child will turn its face away from wherever the mother is. And then the eyes will drop. And sometimes even the child will be so, they'll even begin to kind of drool a little bit. That's a sense of being unacceptable. Now, at 6 months old, it takes a lot of abuse to feel unacceptable. But that's what shame is all about. Now, before we go on, I want to make a quick distinction between guilt and shame, because we get confused in this area a lot. People will be experiencing a sense of shame. Will be wrestling with those things, but they'll talk about it as though it's guilt. They'll say, man, I guess I just have a guilty conscience. I guess, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know, whatever. But here's the big difference, okay? And this will help us understand shame a little bit more. For someone who is wrestling with guilt, they will tend to say this: I feel bad about what I've done. I feel bad about what I've done, or in some cases, what I haven't done. I should have done this. People who wrestle with guilt say the word should a lot. I should be doing that. I should have done this. Or I shouldn't have done this or that. They feel bad about what they have done. Here's the big difference. When we wrestle with shame, it's not about what we've done. When I wrestle with shame, what I say is, I feel bad about who I am. Intrinsically, inside myself as a human being, a defective. There's something inside that's just wrong with me as a human being that I don't necessarily see in other people, even though the way that works its way out may be that I'm critical a lot about other people, or I'm angry about things and point that in people's directions, or I just avoid relationships, or at least relationships with some people. It might work like that, but it's all back about how I feel about myself. I feel bad about who I am. Now, I want to talk very quickly about where shame comes from, okay? There have been vast amounts of studies done on this. But when you boil it all down, when you look at it all, you can find that shame basically is found in 3 places. Here's the first one. First of all, shame is found in what we're going to call cultural standards. Cultural standards. This is why you will hear people, and particularly women, say, "Oh my gosh, I hate my body. I hate my body." Is because we have a perverse cultural standard of what a woman's body should look like. And it is perverse. And so women, particularly young women, will virtually starve themselves to try to gain control so that their body looks the way that our culture says it should, so that they can stop feeling bad about themselves. And it is an epidemic out there. I hate my body. Or for men, it can be a lot of different things as well. Sometimes it's body image for men. Usually for men, it focuses on their competencies, what they can do, what they can't do. If a boy grows up and he's around kids who are great at sports and he is not, he may well begin to feel that the standard of what a boy is someone who is good at sports. And if he is not good at sports, then he may begin to feel like there's something wrong about himself. And even the mention of, hey, let's go play baseball, or there's a football game on, may give him a sense of sharp, heavy painfulness inside. Because even talking about it is a reminder for this young boy that he's defective. There's something wrong with him. Cultural standards, and particularly perverse cultural standards, can totally mess up a society. And that's what we're seeing. Second thing is this, and I'm just going to word it this way: legalistic religions. Legalistic religion says not only do you not measure up to culture, but what really matters is, do you measure up to God? And here are the set of laws that you must follow in order to be approved by God. And sometimes people just give up, but more than not, they decide that they need to work harder. How do I find God's acceptance? I got to work harder. I just got to try harder. I got to be a better person. There's something bad in me that I need to fix, so I'm going to try harder. Now, the problem with this, of course, as we're going to look at in detail in a minute, is that it is usually not, it's never not God saying this is what you need to. It's always people like me, the leader of the church or of the religion, telling you how you're not measuring up. Have you ever noticed that? It's always the guy up front saying, well, here's the standard, here's what you need to do, now get in line. It's the guy up front that when you don't show up on a Sunday calls you and said, no, you weren't in church today. The problem? How's your marriage? Is there sin in your life? No, I had the stomach flu. I was barfing. Do you have the flu? Is there something wrong in your life that gave you the flu? Is there sin there? I know there's sin there. Just tell me. It's legalistic religion. And in fact, my own personal preference is not even to call a relationship with God religion. I just call it a relationship with God. Third one is this, and this is by far the most common, and that is unaccepting parents. Unaccepting parents. Man, parenting is the hardest thing on planet Earth. That's probably why we struggle so much and why we do so many things that we go, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that. But it doesn't take much for a little child who can't understand the ways of the world, but who looks at a parent and expects love, expects approval and acceptance, for that parent to say something like, you don't measure up. You know what? Daddy will approve of you when your grades improve. Right now, I'm just mad at you. But when your grades improve, then I'll smile at you. That builds shame. Neglect, just simply not being there, tells a child internally, I'm not worth Dad coming home for. I'm not worth it. There must be something wrong with me. See, a little child doesn't have the ability, they don't have the categories you guys do as adults to be able to say, well, Dad's, a workaholic, or Dad's out doing something he shouldn't, or Dad's job is just really busy and stressful right now. A child can't do that. A child only knows what it receives from its parents, whom it assumes are authorities because they're older. And so if Dad or Mom or both give a sense that a child is not worthy of acceptance and love, then the child will just receive that message at face value. All you got to do is explode enough times on a child, and they learn there's something wrong with me. Yelling at a child, and especially in public, is one of the best and quickest ways to make a child feel that heavy shame. And if neglect can do it, abuse does it at light speed. A child who grows up in an abusive situation, strangely enough, receives that abuse not as, man, Dad is an idiot, Mom is a nut. You and I can look at that and say, why is that Dad? Guy should be in prison, or whatever. Child doesn't receive it that way. The child receives it that if Mom is doing this to me, if Dad is doing this to me, then that must be what I deserve. Therefore, there must be something wrong with me. Unaccepting parents are the primary place that children find shame. And if we are constantly telling our kids what they're doing wrong, they begin to develop this fine sense of perfectionism, which says, I gotta be perfect. I gotta do things perfect in order to be acceptable. Raise your hand if you're perfect. It was just a test. It was one person back there, okay. Next week we're going to be preaching on humility. Of course, no one's perfect. And Mom and Dad, sir, aren't perfect. But when we're constantly riding our kids on stuff, they get the sense that they must be perfect to be accepted. Now, one more thing, and then we're going to talk about how God is the antidote, okay? One more thing, just kind of help us look at this whole picture. It's a big thing to try to understand. Let's talk about the three selves. If you flip open your bulletin, you can see a thing called three selves. Three selves. And this helps us to understand how this works, okay? The first self, the one that we all think is really us, is what we're going to call the false self. The false self is the self that I believe others expect me to be. Okay? That's the false self. The false self is what children grow up with, thinking that this is what Mom and Dad expect me to be for me to be approved. Many, if not most of us, grew up with that sense of false self. through the culture, through religion we grew up in, or through our parents, or through a combination of all three, through a lot of different things, we grow up with a sense of, this is who I should be. This is who others expect me to be, and therefore who I believe I should be. That's a false self. And I will tell you, the false self constantly gives us false messages that we can never live up to. Therefore, we live our lives in an undeserved shame. Now, the second self is the true self. The true self is who God creates you to be. The true self is the self who you become as you walk with God. It is the self that is bathed in the glory of God. The self that you will ultimately become when Jesus Christ comes back. That's the true self. It is the self that you see Adam and Eve being in the first few chapters of Genesis. This is why at the very end of Genesis 2 it says, and the man and the woman were in the garden. They were naked. They felt no shame. You know why? Because shame wasn't around then. They felt only acceptance and approval from one another. It was the true self. They were being exactly who God created them to be. God didn't create us for shame. Now here's the third self. The third self we're going to call the actual self. And that's the self that I really am right now. That's the self that is not defective, is not unlovable or undeserving of approval or acceptance. That's just who I am. As we would say, that's warts and all. The good things about me, and you have plenty of them, by the way, and the not so good things, and you might have a couple of those too. Things that you wish that you didn't do, and the things that you do just as part of your nature and character that are wonderful and are a great gift to the people around you. And my guess is that most of you, if not all of you, if we could take your not so good and your good and put them in a scale, the good would go way down and the not so good would be like that. Because most of you, if not all of you, have way more good things about you than bad things about you. But unfortunately, if somebody says one bad thing about you, 100 other people can say good things about you, and all you're going to hear is the bad thing about you. That's how we are. So those selves. Now, it is the actual self, who you really are, warts and all, that God looks on, that He treasures, and that He adores and loves. That's the self that I come to God in, and my actual self, and say, God, here I am, warts and all. And God says, I love you. Come to me. I want to restore a relationship with you, and I want you to walk with me, and I want you to know me, and I want to transform your life, to create you into being the person that I've always intended you to be. Let me give you a verse here. Up on the screen, Psalm 3:3. King David says this, but you, talking about God, are a shield around me, O Lord. Now look, you bestow glory on me and lift up my head. You lift up my head. Now, what that means, it's kind of a Hebrewism, Old Testament written in Hebrew, that means God restores me back to a place that I belong. King David wrote that when he had been thrown off the throne and he felt tremendous shame. But as he prayed to God, he began to say, God, you and you alone are the one who can restore me where I really should be. Now think of that baby whose head drops when it feels that rejection. But God being the antidote to all undeserved shame. And the only antidote to undeserved shame is the one who comes to you and who begins to lift your head back up. I just kind of picture it as God walking to us in our shame, getting down on our level, taking our face and looking into our eyes and saying, do you know you matter to me? That's what God is like. And the way that we begin to move out of shame, out of that sense of being not an acceptable human being, is when we begin to truly experience the acceptance of God. So let's talk about this. I'm going to give you a few more things to write down. You ready? let's talk about how God is an antidote. Here's the first way that God works. When God comes to me and he begins to lift my head, begins to lift your head, begins to look into your eyes with his love and his care, the very first thing that God is going to want you to do or want me to do as he's beginning to heal me of this undeserved shame is he's going to want me to be honest about that shame. Being honest about my shame works in a couple of ways. One, it's simply having the courage to admit I feel bad about myself, but it might be undeserved. I feel broken. I feel discouraged. I feel negative. It's how I feel. And I will tell you, just as an aside, it's nice if you have somebody who has a good enough heart and is mature enough that you can look at that person and you can say, this is really how I feel about myself. Because we just, we put up this barrier because nobody wants to walk around with other people thinking how you really think about yourself, And so, hey, how you doing? Oh, doing great, man. Yourself? When the truth is, maybe you're not doing so great. Maybe you're feeling this heavy weight on you, that you're defective in some way, which, of course, is a false message that you're receiving. Now, here's the other thing, and this is important, okay? As I'm being honest about my shame, it is absolutely essential that I'm honest about how that shame works out of me. Now, I need to be honest about it being there. I need to be honest about where it's come from, which can be very painful, to begin to pray through and talk through with someone that I trust, things that occurred to me as a child, things I grew up with. That can be very difficult to bring that poison out of my life. It can hurt, but it's important. But then it's equally important on the other side to say, and do you know how this shame works its way to me? And then be honest. It works its way out in addiction. How about that? Did you know the primary basis for all addiction, whatever it is shame, undeserved shame? Alcoholism, drug abuse, pornography, gambling, on and on and on and on and on the addictions go. Just think of an addiction as something in your life that has more power over you than you have over it. That's what an addiction looks like. Something that controls you more than you control it. But psychologists have known for a long time that the fuel for those addictions is a sense inside that something's not right about me. And so when I fall into my addiction, at least I can forget for a while. At least I can have a sense of adrenaline or a sense of being, feeling positive or whatever it might be. It takes away that heavy, painful feeling for a little while. Addiction is a huge thing that we need to be honest about. But not to kick ourselves, not to say, well, I got an addiction because I'm defective. It's where that usually goes. I read about a man named John Bradshaw, who was a psychologist, who was a raging alcoholic. And he said, I would just get drunk. I lost my business. I was losing my family. And it felt so painful. I felt so bad about myself. I'm a defective human being. And so I would try to take care of that pain. I'd go get drunk. And then when I sobered up, I would kick myself because I'd gotten drunk and realized the only reason I'm doing that is I'm a defective person. So the addiction just continually feeds into the feelings that I'm not a good human being inside. I'm defective. I'm broken. Now, in a few months, we're going to talk about the sinful nature and how that works. And that will balance out what I'm saying a little bit more here. But it's important to understand that I have to start with honesty. God loves honesty. And he loves it when I can be honest with myself, with God, and with other people about what I'm wrestling with on the inside. Look at what King David says again. Search me, O God. Know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me. That's being honest, huh? And lead me in the way lasting. I love the use of the word anxiety because one of the primary reasons we have anxiety is because of shame. All works together. Now, second way God begins to heal us of this toxic shame, the way he is the antidote, is this. As I begin to be honest with God and just laying it on the table, just saying what it is and how I respond, the second thing God is going to lead you to do is to receive his acceptance. Just receive his acceptance. Now, this can be incredibly difficult to do. Do you know why? I don't feel acceptable. How can I receive God's acceptance if I don't feel like an acceptable person? God, like people, is not going to accept me until I become acceptable. So goes the logic. So goes the life of heavy, undeserved shame. But what God will lead me to do is to acknowledge that acceptance is there and receive it. By the way, if you're looking for a word of why God does this, it is the word grace. Grace. Grace is the love and acceptance of God that I do not deserve. It's grace. When I was in seminary, I was in first year class. There were probably about 100 of us in this class. And one day, the teacher had told us, and we'd go to class every other day, the teacher said, okay, I want you to read. This is about, it's probably average about 500 pages of reading any given week in seminary. And so the teacher said, okay, I want you to read this page. It's about 80 pages. And he said, I want you to be familiar with it. I want you to know it. Okay, read these chapters, blah, blah, blah. We'll get that done. Well, the next day of that class, we show up, and the teacher says, okay, take out a piece of paper, and we're going to have a quiz on your reading. And you could just see the whole class go, uh-oh. He gave us the test, and he said, okay, now switch papers. Person next to you, switch papers. He said, okay, here's the answers, blum, 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 blum. Here's the breakdown of how you should grade it, blum, 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 blum. Went through that, said switch papers back. And he said, okay, raise your hand if you got an A. No one raised their hand. Raise your hand if you got a B. 2 nerds raised their hand. Raise your hand if you got a C. That was quite a bit of us. I got a C minus. Raise your hand if you got a D. That was the majority of the class. Raise your hand if you got an F. 4 or 5 people raised their hands. F. You said, okay, now take your pen or pencil, whatever you have to write with, and I want you to scratch that grade out, and I want you to put A on it. And we all looked at each other like, I can't do that. I don't deserve an A. Except for the guys who got Fs. They were having a revival in the back. Woo! A, baby! I never got an A before. It was one of the hardest things you can imagine. It seems like we would all be like, oh, hallelujah. This is great. Ha! It was like 5% of our grade. Just want to give yourself an A. And we looked at each other, and he said, okay, I want to ask you now, how many of you are having a hard time writing an A on your paper because you don't deserve it? Our hands all went up, except the guys who got Fs, who were always in the back. Our hands all went up. And he said, okay, this is your first lesson about grace. I'm giving you a blessing you haven't earned. And that is the nature of God. To give us blessings and love and acceptance we have not earned. That's grace. Let me read another scripture for you. Up on the screen, out of the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul writing says, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, that's who God is, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions, meaning we had no relationship with him and couldn't find our way to a relationship with him. It was as if we were spiritually dead. Then he says, it is by grace you have been saved. That's what grace looks like. Now, one final thing. One more thing God will lead us to do. Final thing God is going to lead me or you to do is to believe what God says. Believe what God says. One of the biggest problems we have is we listen to our false self, constantly giving us false messages, sometimes that false self has been giving us for decades, and we believe those about ourselves, instead of believing what God tells us about ourselves. We believe the false message instead of the true message. What God says about me is true. What my false self says about me is false. And something can happen just because you're a person. You know, you could do something you maybe feel embarrassed about or whatever, but because you're a person, you won't say, if you're dealing with shame, you won't say, well, it's just, people do that. Oops, shouldn't have done that, or whatever. But you'll say, oh, I did that because I'm an idiot. You know what I mean? Your false self will say, the reason you did that, which every person does, is because there's something defective about you. I'll tell you one more story. I'm going to give you 3 things God says about you. When I was in college, I worked at a department store. And I worked in what was called domestics. You know what that is? Pillows, sheets, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And they put me in I managed the department for a while, and then I went part-time to go to college. So they put me in a department that virtually nobody wanted, which was custom window treatments. Can you imagine? Would you trust me as a 25-year-old to figure out what you should have in your house on your windows? Custom window treatments. But most people just refer to it as drapes. Where's Kevin? Oh, he's in drapes. We sold a lot. We had mini blinds, for heaven's sakes, but drapes. That's all it is, drapes. So I'm down one day coming off of a break, and I should tell you, I'd been fighting a really bad cold for about a week. And I see a friend of mine who was in high school with me, who is now working in the same department store. And we're walking along. She's coming off of a break as well. And I say, hey, it's good to see you. Where are you working now? And she tells me. And I say, well, how are you doing? She says, I'm doing good. And she says, how are things in drapes? Now, in order to be funny, which almost never goes right for me, I say, hanging in there. But as I say that, everything that was in my nasal cavity for the last week decided to come out. Hanging in there. And she does this as we're walking along. Oh, Kevin. Now, shame would say, God, you're an idiot. Don't even talk to people. God, you're so stupid. Normal person wouldn't have done that. You ever been talking to somebody and you spit on them? You ever done that? Yeah, you're laughing, so I know you have. And it's always people like you don't want. It's not your, kid or your husband or whatever you don't care about. Is if you spit on them, you care about. But it's like your boss, right? And we always are just like, I can't believe. This guy was trying to hire me one time for a position on a missions agency. And he says, we've got our eye on you. We love what you're doing. We're looking at you. And I'm all, well, thanks. Right on his blue blazer. And he looked down like that, And I'm all, what do you do? This is what I do. I rub it off. Oh, sorry about that. It's just being human being. Jesus probably spit on people once in a while. Can't you see him giving this eloquent sermon? And he says, blessed are the pure in heart. When he says pure, a little bit of spit mixed with fish goes flying out, lands right on Peter's arm, right? And Peter goes, whatever. It's just being human. But if I have a false self that's working in me, I'll take that just human thing, and instead of laughing about it or going, oh, sorry, or saying, well, everybody does that kind of stuff, I'll say, I did that because I'm defective. I'm defective. So a big part of God rescuing us from our undeserved shame is to begin to listen what God says about me. Now, here's the last thing we're going to do. I'm going to give you 3 statements God makes about you, and I want you to write these down. Now, because we have part of our church family whose first language is Arabic, I'm giving them to you in Arabic, okay? All right. And what we're going to do is we are going to say these together. And if your first language is Arabic, you say them in Arabic, okay? Yeah? I want to see some. Okay, as loud as you can, like the whole congregation speaking Arabic. If your first language is Mandarin Chinese, sorry, I don't know anybody who speaks that. All right, here's the first one up on the board. Let's bring up the first statement. Here we go. Ready? Here we go. Up on the board. Let's read them together. Ready? Together. I am loved by God. Good job, guys. I was going to do Arabic, but I didn't want to show off. I am loved by God. What does God say about you? He looks at you, he holds up your face, he looks you in the eyes and says, I love you. Can you receive that today? Let's do the next one. Here's the next phrase. Next thing God says about me is this. Ready? Here we go, together. I am accepted by God. Now that's a hard one because we don't feel acceptable. We feel like we haven't earned it. But when God looks at us, he says, I love you, I accept you. Not because you deserve it, because I choose to. And you know, the reality is, you are worthy of God's love and acceptance. Let that sink in for a while. You haven't deserved it, you haven't earned it, but you're worthy of it. Just as my kids get my love and acceptance, and I feed them and give them a place to live and some treats along the way, not because they have earned those things. Raise your hands if your kids have earned all that they have in your head. Nobody, right? Yeah. A little boy back there is all. Right here. You're a good man. You're preaching next week, by the way, just so you know. They don't earn it, but they're worthy of it. You know why my kids are worthy of my love and acceptance and the blessings I pour on them? You know why they're worthy of it? Because they're mine. Why am I worthy of God's love and acceptance and the blessings he gives me? Because you are his. You belong to him. And he loves you and accepts you as you are. Isn't that nice? Your actual self. Now here's the last one. We're going to close with this, then we're going to go into communion time. Up on the screen, let's read this together. Anybody want to try Arabic? Go for it. You guys, you have to, okay? Here we go. Together. I am valued by God. Now that's hard to believe sometimes because if I feel defective, I don't believe I have any real value. I believe I'm not even worthy to be loved. But what God says is that you have value to God. And I can choose to believe the messages of my false self, or I can choose to believe, which is a much wiser thing to do, what God says about me.